I joined GSVlabs in May of last year from Coursera, where I was the Chief Business and Chief Content Officer. And as some of you know, Coursera is the world's largest higher education platform, and it's been at the forefront of democratizing higher education by making high-quality educational programs available to people around the world at affordable prices. I joined GSVlabs because I saw the opportunity for us to do for entrepreneurship and innovation what Coursera has done for higher education. Entrepreneurship and innovation is growing around the world, and we need to make sure that entrepreneurs and innovators have the resources that they need that are offered to our members here in Silicon Valley, but we need to be able to extend our reach and take that to people around the world. And that is the mission that we are engaged in. At GSV, GSV stands for Global Silicon Valley. So we say that we connect and build bridges between Silicon Valley and the world to Silicon Valley. So within our network, in addition to GSVlabs, we have several investment vehicles, GSV Capital, GSV Accelerate, amongst them. And some of you know us for the ASU GSV Summit, which is the largest higher education technology summit in the world right now. But our mission, GSV as a whole, is to make sure that people around the world have the opportunity to succeed and are given the tools and resources and learning and education that they need to make successful lives. This event today is focused around trying to ensure that that process starts as early as possible, and we know that those formative years are actually school years. And so what can we do to train and empower and educate students in a way that they're ready for the opportunities of the 21st century? And it's our honor to have with us an extremely distinguished panel, Pam Cantor, Jim Shelton, and Carlos Watson, to discuss how do we create the school of the future. Before the panel discussion, though, it is my privilege to introduce to you our special guest for the evening, Dr. Pamela Cantor. Pam is a physician by training. She practiced child psychiatry for nearly 2 decades, specializing in trauma and childhood trauma. She's a visiting scholar in education at Harvard, the author of numerous peer-reviewed papers on how children develop and learn, a leader of the Science of Learning and Development Initiative, and a distinguished scientist on the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. Pam founded the nonprofit Turnaround for Children, and you'll see posters for it. There's also some literature on your chairs. Please take some time to look at that. She founded Turnaround for Children on the heels of the September 11 attacks, with the focus on addressing the ongoing and under-recognized challenge in our public school system, which is how experiences of trauma and adversity hinder the way children develop and learn. Turnaround has spent the last 16 years working with one foot in science and asking what does it take for all children to be successful, and the other foot in the education system, working with over 125 schools around the country and gaining unique expertise in how to equip educators to help all students thrive. Now Turnaround wants to scale its impact beyond the 4,000 educators and 50,000 students that they will impact this year. And it wants to do this because the science Pam studies, the science of learning and development, compels her to push for a 21st century education system that is organized very differently from what most of us know today. So please join me in welcoming Pam Cantor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me just put this down. Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming on a windy, rainy day. I wondered whether this would deter you, and I'm so glad to see that it didn't. There are many reasons why a person would go to med school and become a doctor. But for me, the reasons were really clear. I went to med school because I wanted to study trauma, to put myself in a position where one day I would be a doctor and I would be able to work with children who had known trauma and help them heal. This was because I knew trauma as a child. I grew up in a neighborhood with lots of cousins living nearby, so there were always sleepovers. And when I was 6 years old, my uncle came into the room where I was sleeping and sexually abused me. I don't know to this day how many times it happened, but I do know that I was terrified to tell my parents. I was afraid that they wouldn't believe me. And one night, I had this dream in which I saw myself dying. And I became so frightened that I knew that I had to tell them. And when I did, my parents said, "You can never breathe a word of this to anybody, because if you do, the family will be hurt." Even at 6, I knew that it felt as if they were angry at me and not him, and I didn't understand that. My mother carried a shame over this that made it really difficult for her to take care of me, and my father seemed angry at me all the time. There was no help and no protection for years, just a deep secret that burrowed its way in every aspect of our lives until the day they died, literally the day they died. Their deaths were 1 decade apart, but for both of them, their last words to me were the same. They said, "I'm sorry." But I did get help when I was 15 years old from this amazing psychiatrist. He was this big man with a booming voice and a big storyteller. And he said, I was a pearl in an oyster. Not this ugly, dirty thing that I thought I was. He could make me believe anything. But it all really boiled down to just one thing. I was good, when up until that point, I believed that I was bad. So you can imagine on this day that I marched into his office and I said, "I'm going to be a doctor." And he looked at me and he said, "Of course you are." And I thought to myself, did he not know that up until that point, I hadn't taken a single science or math class? I was an art major. But like everything else, he was the reason I wanted to do it, and he was the person who made me believe I could. Med school turned out to be this amazing, amazing universe where mysteries were unpacked every single day. I learned that there were these complex biological mechanisms that explain everything we're able to do. Okay, and not just the obvious things of how our hearts and lungs work, but how we love, how we attach, how we become conscious, and most of all, how we heal when things go wrong. The first year turned out to be everything I expected, a ton of facts, biology, anatomy, physiology, but all about what the body does when it's healthy. But it was the second year of med school where the deeper mysteries of human life were revealed, because in that year, you learn about what happens when things go awry. So there were these 2 big things that I didn't anticipate. The first was that doctors don't study illness just to learn about illness. They study illness to learn about health. They like studying and seeing the variations and the patterns, because when they see them again, they're going to know how to get someone healthy. So this was the first big thing. You study illness to learn about health. This was a very, very different way of looking at things, but it reminded me of the way my doctor looked at me, not as this ill, broken thing. He wanted to understand exactly what had gone awry in my life so that he could get me healthy again. The second truly big thing is that the major, powerful set of forces causing mechanisms to go awry is context, the environments, experiences, and relationships of our lives. So you mean context drives our biology and our genetics? This was completely different than what I expected because I thought genes were the drivers. But genes are chemical followers. They're little packages of protein covered with receptors that are triggered by the environments and relationships in our lives. Genes are chemical followers. This means that genes are not the drivers of who we become. Context drives who we become, and by context, I mean community, health, nutrition, families, teachers, schools. So right at the beginning, there were these two huge things. And then it begins to make more sense that if I tell you that you have 25,000 genes in your genome, we all do, and in your lifetime, fewer than 10% of those genes are going to get expressed. Okay, what determines what's in the 10%? It's context. This is, in a nutshell, what defines human life. It's incredibly simple in many ways. So context is this all-important thing, but how does it exactly get in the body and into the brain? The brain is up there in the skull, separated from the body by the blood-brain barrier. And on top of that, we're mammals. And as mammals, our brains develop largely after we're born. This is crucial to understand. The human brain develops largely after we're born. So if you think about human babies and think about how helpless they are, and yet when you look at them, they change just a little bit every day. If you were a horse, you would be born walking and running and doing the things that horses do, but not human babies. Their brains are astonishingly malleable. And the growth and development of the human brain is experience dependent. So there are critical periods. We know that 0 to 5 is 1. But there are new critical periods being discovered, and one of those is early adolescence. This is really important for those of us who are educators. What we know is that the human brain continues to grow well into early adulthood. So taken together, what does all this mean? It means that the human brain is this dynamic living structure that is made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. And the three things that you need to know about brain development are astonishing malleability, experience-dependent growth, role of context. And all of that means that there is no such thing as a developing child independent of context. So how does context get inside? In order to describe that, I have to tell you about the limbic system, because the limbic system is where learning happens. It consists of three structures: the prefrontal cortex, which is focused on attention and concentration, the hippocampus, many responsibilities in memory, and the amygdala, which houses the emotional memories in our lives. These structures are interconnected, cross-wired, and they develop together. In addition, the limbic system is covered with receptors for two hormonal systems: the stress response system and the system governing trust and love. So when we think about stress, we think about the hormone cortisol, and when we think about trust and love, The messenger is the hormone oxytocin. So when we talk about how context gets inside, that's what we mean. So if we talk about the stress response, when we experience stress, what happens? Cortisol is released through our brains and our bodies. We get that fight, flight, freeze feeling. How many of you have ever had that feeling? Okay, that is the normal stress response. And it's intense when it happens, but it's adaptive. You know, it helps us prepare for a test, for a recital. It makes us sharp. But this is your limbic system at work: attention, concentration, focus, memory. But children who have high levels of stress, stress that is not buffered by the presence of a trusted adult, for them something else happens. They can get locked in fight or flight where the feeling doesn't let up. And children who have this level of stress, these children really struggle to focus, and they get easily triggered in schools. So cortisol can do damage to the structures of the limbic system, because now we know adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But this isn't the end of the story. There's a big upside when we talk about the hormone oxytocin. This is the hormone that produces feelings of love and trust and safety. But here's the more interesting thing. Oxytocin hits the same structures as the hormone cortisol, but it is the more powerful of the two hormones at the level of the cell. Relationships that are strong, positive, consistent can trigger this system. And this hormone not only helps children manage stress, prevent the damage from the hormone cortisol, but enables kids to become resilient to future stress. Relationships of this kind are not just being nice to a child. These are consistent, caring, trustful, protective relationships. The human relationship is the most powerful example we have of positive context. How many of you have heard about the marshmallow test? Okay, that's good. This was a test that was done in the 60s at Stanford in a nursery school. And children were put in a room with a marshmallow. And they were told that if they could delay eating that marshmallow for more than 20 minutes, they would get a second marshmallow. The findings from this study were correlated with high SAT scores, college acceptance, later success in life. Okay, let's take a look at how it went. So let's fast forward to 2012. Dr. Celeste Kidd was a researcher at University of Rochester who had worked in a homeless shelter. She asked herself, would any of my kids from the homeless shelter ever have waited for that second marshmallow? So she decided to repeat the test, but change the conditions. She brought each child into a room where there were broken crayons on the desk. And she said to them, I'm going to come back and bring you a brand new set of crayons. So what she did was, with half the kids, she brought that new set of crayons. But with half the kids, she said, sorry, I can't do it. And then she repeated the marshmallow test. What do you think happened? Okay, you know. When the promise was kept, the child waited, no problem, and got the second marshmallow. But for the kids where the promise was broken, they gobbled up that first marshmallow right away. It turns out that being able to exhibit that skill of self-control had something to do with whether you trusted the person who was giving you the marshmallow. But what Dr. Kidd did was she challenged the assumptions of the original test. She understood that this incredibly important skill of self-control is not just in the kid. It's in the kid in a context designed to reveal the skill. In this case, through the experience of a trustful relationship. This researcher was able to alter the microenvironment to reveal the malleable skill of self-control by building trust with the children. Think about what this story means if we could design an educational context that would reveal the skills that children have, the talents they have, and then imagine the talents and the skills we as adults don't see and won't see until we design the environments that reveal them. So I want to take you back to 2001. I was practicing that year as a child psychiatrist, and as you know, Nikhil mentioned this, it was the year of 9/11. And if you asked me back then, did I know the role of context and trust in children's lives? I believed I did. The Mailman School of Public Health and the Department of Education asked me to help lead a study to answer the question, what were the effects of 9/11 on New York City's public school kids? And of course, what we thought was the most profound effects were going to be in the kids, in the schools, in the vicinity of Ground Zero. But that's not what the data showed. What the data showed is that the greatest effects were in the kids, in schools, in communities of deepest poverty. So we wanted to find out what was behind the data. So we went to visit schools. And I'll never forget walking into an elementary school in the South Bronx where a teacher was helping kids to digest the 9/11 event by asking them to draw a picture. And this little boy who was 6 years old came up to me and showed me his picture. And there were these two boxes in the background with smoke coming out. And in the foreground were two stick figure boys pointing guns at each other. It was the immediate local context of this child's life that was frightening him and activating stress and the mechanisms that we've been talking about. This became a personal turning point for me. This was when I left my practice and I founded Turnaround for Children, because what I saw in the classrooms across New York City were lots of children whose learning was being interfered with by the stressful context in their lives. And I saw an education system that was trying to do all it could to improve academics without understanding the role of stress on the very systems of the brain that are involved in learning. I realized that if we narrowly target academics and we don't develop the skills and mindsets of successful, engaged learners and understand the barriers and the accelerants to that process, children aren't going to be able to do what we're asking them to do. And worse, if you then up the academic pressure, lots and lots of kids will fall farther behind. This issue is one of the most insidious and most under-recognized reasons for the persistence of the achievement gap. So Turnaround was founded on this idea that we were going to design tools, services, and practices that would enable any school to become a positive developmental force in a child's life. And to this day, this is what Turnaround's mission is dedicated to. We've got one foot in the science of learning, and we have another foot in the application of that science to practice. In 2017, we became members of the Science of Learning and Development Initiative, actually one of their leaders. And we had as a partner the extraordinary leadership and vision of Jim Shelton and his team at Zuckerberg. Our group produced a major synthesis of the science that was published just last year in the Journal of Applied Developmental Science, where we answered the question, okay, if we are going to have a 21st century education system based on 21st century science, what science should we be paying attention to? You can download these papers, they're on Turnaround's website. But the short answer is what the science calls for is the comprehensive development of each and every learner through whole child personalization of learning. The science calls for a design mapped to the way the brain learns. And this design combines rich and strong relationships, environments filled with safety and belonging, rich instructional experiences, supports, but most of all, the intentional development of the skills and mindsets of all learners. But here's the thing that's most important and what the field most needs. It needs practices, tools, in different forms so that every principal, teacher, and coach knows how to make this a reality in a school and a classroom. If what we do is truly about all kids, we need the tools to be able to do it. Have any of you seen this framework? Jim has definitely seen it. This is the building blocks for learning. It was developed by Brooke Stafford Brizard when she was at Turnaround, where we were wanting to answer a question. How does any child become a productive, engaged learner? Because if we knew that, and if there were pathways like there are for reading and math, we could design classrooms and practices and tools to develop learners. Because every skill in this framework is malleable, it can be built, and every one of them is highly correlated with achievement. But the big aha for us in doing this was recognizing that the 20th century education system was never designed to develop the learner, never designed to develop these skills. It was designed to fill kids with content, to test them, and then to sort them into who gets to go to competitive colleges and competitive jobs, which is a lot of what it does even today. So think about that, an education system that wasn't designed to develop the learner, wasn't designed for equity, and wasn't designed to unleash children's potential. What it would take to bring this framework to life in a school are classrooms that are strong in relationships and teamwork, adults that know about learning science and the developing brain, and tools, integrated tools and digital platforms that are not just about content, that are about developing engaged, productive, self-directed, curious learners. And, oh, sorry. And these tools could exist in many forms. They could exist in videos. We've recently done quite a few with our colleagues at Edutopia, apps, tablets, and new platforms. Practitioners today are craving integrated tools, and the market for them is immense and it is global. So here's the good news. Today, this is possible in a way that just wasn't true even 20 years ago. Right now, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you whether you believe that skills are things that some kids have and some kids don't. That some kids are capable and other kids are not. Because if you believe that, then you are with the mathematician Sir Francis Galton, who in the 1890s believed that our abilities as humans fell into rankings, into bins, depending on how near or far you were from the average. If you believe this, you need to read Todd Rose's book, The End of Average. Or are you with Benjamin Bloom? Benjamin Bloom was an educator who, in his 2 Sigma paper, said that what one child can do, all children can do under favorable conditions. Because if you are with Bloom, this means challenging the assumptions of what children are capable of and challenging the goals of the system itself. Because skills exist in a potential state in all children. And if we continue to use standardized approaches, it's going to work for some kids and not for others. And standardized approaches will not identify the talents and the potential in many children. In fact, if a Mozart or a Martin Luther King were sitting in a classroom today, the way many of our classrooms are designed, we wouldn't know that they were there. We've reached the limit of what is achievable through standardized approaches, just as many other fields have. Cancer researchers were stuck. They knew that they had cures that worked for some patients and not others. They asked why. And it was only when this research began to embrace the complexity of understanding the precise context of the individual that these researchers developed more and more targeted cures. This was an inflection point in cancer research that led to many, many more cures for patients, because they understood they had to change the microenvironments of cancer cells. Reform is linear. Accountability, test scores, no excuses. These are not sufficiently transformational approaches. Believing that we can achieve breakthroughs, doing what we've been doing and doing it a little bit better, it's not going to get us there. What we need are ways of challenging our assumptions about human growth and potential, because if we do that, exponential change becomes possible. And that requires an approach grounded in what we know about human development, learning science, and the development of the brain. And it starts with this mind-blowing insight that relationships and context grow the brain, trigger the expression of our genes, harness the malleability of the brain to unlock each child's potential. We can ask and answer the exact same question that the cancer researchers asked, that Celeste Kidd asked with the marshmallow test. What will work for this child in this context? Because it is that question that gets you to fundamentally different answers for what our school of the future needs to look like and what our education system of the future needs to look like. And the doctor who saved my life did exactly that and altered the trajectory of my life forever. The message in the science is optimistic. Genes are chemical followers. This is the biologic truth that context shapes the expression of our genetic potential. Schools designed, as Bloom said, using the levers of human development such that what one person can do, all children can do. This is our school of the future. This is what Turnaround's mission is dedicated to see and unleash the potential in each and every child. so that every child thrives. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Warmer hand than that, pretty please. I'm Carlos Watson. I'm the editor of OZY, a member of the GSV family, and really pleased to be here with everyone today. And Pam, I so appreciated what you shared. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Carlos.
Jim Shelton, many of you know, recently served as president of the Zuckerberg Initiative. Prior to that, served President Obama for how many years?
About 6.
About 6 years in the Department of Education in a variety of roles, and longtime leader in education policy here and around the globe. And so we're going to have a little bit of a conversation. I'm told that we don't typically take questions, but we're going to break rules today, and we're going to take a few questions after we have a little bit of conversation. So, Jim, let me start with you. I thought it was really interesting. You were more animated. I've known you for 20 years, longer if I don't want to admit it, but you were more animated than I've seen you in a long time about Pam's work. I know that you didn't even think you were going to be able to fly out. I know you did unnatural things to be here today. So for those who don't know where your enthusiasm for Pam and her work comes from, give us a little bit of perspective. Put Pam in context.
So let me just start this way. How many of you actually have kids? Okay. How many of you think they're simple? Right? And so the very instinct that you have about your child is the truth about every single child. That all of these things, they come together. Their mental health, their physical health, how they see themselves in the world, how they see themselves in a given moment in a classroom. Am I a math person? Yeah, I see my own son. He's a math person depending on who the teacher is that year, right? And so there's this part about the fact that the science is very clear, but it resonates with our deepest instincts about our own children, and frankly then begs the question, so then how do you build a system that actually can meet the complexity of each child? And people have been talking about this achievement gap. I want to frame it as the gap between performance and potential, right? Like, we now know that there is this potential, this really high bar. And when you dig through the science, it says every child basically has the potential to meet that. Not in a slogan-y, all children can learn kind of way. Like in a hard science, we all have the machinery to get this done. And the things that are getting in our way can be dealt with in a deliberate way. So now I can move past ideology to methodology, and that makes me super excited. And I guess the other part is, like, I've been trying to figure this out for a long while, and the only reason I think that it has happened is because of Pam, where she was able to have the belief and then the will and then the knowledge to pull all this together in a way that I think will ultimately be transformational. And so I'm deeply grateful.
Pam, who struggles, for all the Jims in the world who believe deeply in your work and in his words, knew it instinctually and instinctively, and we're looking for someone with the scientific background to bring it to the fore and allow it to be used in a broader setting. For all the Jims who had that confidence in you, who's most resistant to your message? Who struggles to buy into to what you're offering?
Yeah. The way that our system is structured right now, there is a way in which incentives are aligned. And you would want incentives to be aligned toward the optimal growth of a child, but they're really actually not aligned that way. They're much more aligned to a narrow definition of performance by children who must perform. They must perform on exams, and if they perform well on exams, then their teachers will be rewarded, their leaders will be rewarded. So if you just follow the chain of incentives, we are getting what those incentives are aligned to do. If people had the vision that Jim had, and Jim can tell you, I've been talking in his ear for years and years and years, when I didn't like what he was doing, when I liked what he was doing, but all of it boiled down to what he said. I was telling him that the mental model you have to have about what's possible for children is not this narrow. It's got to be bigger. And we have to look at the assumptions we carry. If we believe in children's potential, check. Well, and if we believe it's possible for all kids, check. Then that gets you to a fundamentally different view of how teaching and learning needs to be organized. And in a nutshell, that's what I've been talking to Jim about for all of these years. But if you say that to a principal, what you will see is somebody's face stiffen up and their body position kind of, because they're going to be asking, what else are you asking me to do? Okay, how can I do that? Look at what I have to do in a given day. Look at what my teachers have to do in a given day. It's not possible. So our system is organized toward a given result and moving it from there. Now, the other thing I will tell you is that in a private conversation with that same leader talking about children, they believe exactly what Jim believes. In their heart of hearts, they know that children have to be grown in a much more holistic way to get to the outcomes we want.
So if we want a meaningfully different world, we want to put our kids on a different path, a path that may be more right for them, I think you said in one of your decks, to lead the life that they choose. Are we better off focusing, and I know it doesn't have to be either or, but I'm making it either or for the moment. Are we better off focusing on changing the mindset of their parents or changing the mindset of policymakers? What would help our kids more? Because I assume a lot of parents also have a narrow view of which of our kids can thrive and what thriving means for them, and that some of what you're saying also would be broadening for them as well. Would you rather spend more time with the parents and trying to offer the thoughts you have, or would you rather spend more time with the principals and have them begin to think differently?
Well, speaking as a person who ran an organization that was dedicated to what a school could be, I focus very much on the adults in the school. But if you were asking me, what do I think are the levers that can bring about the kind of irritating sort of change that we want to bring about, I think parents are a big factor because they vote, they can demand things for their children that educators have to listen to. So I think there is some real untapped power in parents, but they have to have a language for what they're asking for. And I think some of the work we are doing in the Science of Learning and Development Initiative is directed toward that, toward what to ask for and what to expect.
Jim, a number of years ago, I was surprised to hear Reed Hastings tell me that he thought the best change, particularly in the education space, was slow change. And he continued to tell me that he had initially thought that fast-paced change was best, but that he realized that sometimes in his mind, change would happen quickly and then it would recede. And so that he thought that slower change that might be sustainable and might be firmly adopted by the system would be better. When you talk about the ideas that Pam has here and you think about trying to bring it alive, would we be better trying to see rapid change that brought it about, or would Reed be right and we should think about this is a 20, 30, 40, 50-year journey towards making this the norm?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit. What we are talking about is fundamentally changing people's belief systems, right? That's a long-term change. Our culture, especially American culture, is built on the belief that some people have it and some people don't. And our systems are built to reflect that culture and that belief system. And so to change that culture, it's going to take time. But there are things that we can begin to change right away that will create a different context. I want to push back a little bit on some of what Pam said, because I definitely know that the incentives drive behavior. But what drives behavior just as much is what you believe you should do to get the incentive. So if I believe, let's say the incentive is a test score, and I believe the way to get to a better test score is to strip away all the art and music, take away playtime, and pound away on kids' heads about reading and math all day. That is one way that I will try to get my test scores up. If I believe that the way you actually get kids to be able to do well academically is to provide them a rich environment full of love, with lots of variety of things that get them excited and engaged in being there, then you respond to the same incentive structure a very different way. And so we have to figure out how to balance our incentive structure so that people are paying. These are things you can do quickly, right? You can say, these other things, these other dimensions of children are really important. We're going to start looking at whether or not you're attending to these other elements of children. And that will get people to change their behaviors pretty quickly. But at the same time, we have to actually change their underlying belief set about how you get to the kind of things that we all want our kids to be able to know and be able to do, so that they can solve the problems that we're going to leave them. And you're right, this is not either or. We have to be willing to do both. Incentives are quick, belief systems are long. And then the other things we can do is, we just described something incredibly complex. And yet, we have not changed the tools largely that are available to our teachers significantly, ever, right? Since we created classrooms. And so giving teachers better tools, better insight, better resources that allow for these personalized pathways, it is an inevitability of being able to meet each child where they are and help them reach their full potential. And that we can do a lot faster than we've done.
Pam, we're sitting here in Silicon Valley, so the obvious question is going to be, how much can technology help in this, particularly when Jim talks about new tools and how rapidly you can move it. But other people, I feel like, are increasingly saying that we probably have overweighted maybe what technology can do here. And in part, some of what you've talked about today makes me almost feel like part of you might take a step back from overusing technology in this space. How do you think about technology's role in bringing about the sea change that you and Jim are talking about in our belief systems and in the tools that teachers have, and maybe even in the incentives that...
Well, a big part of what GSV opened my eyes to when I spoke there last year at the big meeting was this giant audience of very, very creative people and investors that were very, very interested in tomorrow, and also today and tomorrow. And so this universe, I guess I wonder, why couldn't this universe be a force for much, much more in the way of integrated tools? Because right now, technology and its purposes have been relatively narrow. I think they could become much broader. And one concrete example would be, why couldn't you teach math and executive function at the same time? Why not? And why not build platforms that would enable these things to be integrated? And how great would that be for teachers who would then be able to personalize their relationships with kids, but not have to do everything? So my interest and dedication to learning about this community is because I think they could provide some of the answers.
Take me around the world. This is, after all, GSV, Global Silicon Valley. I'll ask both you and Jim. Who else outside of the U.S. is doing parts of what you'd like to see really well, maybe even better than we're doing it here?
China.
Is that right?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I think the thing that that I would say is...
Can I pause you for a second?
Yeah.
Who expected her to say China? All the smart people. Okay, good. Okay.
Why I'm saying that is, really for two reasons. One is that the level of curiosity coming from that country about science and about developmental science, they go at it in some pretty interesting ways, meaning they want a populace that are creative. They want them to be more flexible thinkers. We have had teams of people wanting to learn about SEL. So I think, is this going to be a country that begins to understand the context, the issue of context drives development? And because they don't have so much infrastructure, they get to build for today. Okay, and building for today would be building based on what we know about what develops children. Now, there are big problems in China as well, and we're certainly hearing a good bit about that because of the deprivations and a lot of the trauma that exists in that country. But most people talk about places like Finland, and I'm very, very well aware about the countries that are the signature countries for things like developing teachers and teaching. But when I think about a country that is going to learn what needs to be learned to design a school of the future, one of my bets would be on China.
That's absolutely interesting. I'm embarrassed to say I would not have that would not have been my guess.
Sure
Jim, where would you? Where would you say that something interesting is happening or likely to happen?
So I think it's Pam brings up a great point. If you talk about today, then I look at a bunch of different places that are doing a much better job on even the basic blocking and tackling, right? So this notion that kids' mental and physical health needs to be addressed and any shortcomings need to be accommodated in order for them to be able to have the opportunity to do their best work in school. Like there are tons of countries that actually just do a lot better job than that than us. It's about their core infrastructure and social infrastructure for making sure kids don't live in the conditions of poverty. There are folks who have already gotten into the idea of leveraging relationship as a powerful lever to be able to do more rigorous work. And you can find those examples here in the US as well. They're isolated. But when you say who is doing what Pam is talking about, which is looking across the science, looking at how do you actually scale a system that can meet every child where they are, take everything that we know about these areas of science, and frankly, something that we're going to have to wrestle with, using the data that, one of the really powerful uses of technology in this work is that you don't just get to see the outcome of the learning, you can actually watch the process of the learning. Right? You can see the choices that are made. You can see the difficulty. More and more, you can sense frustration and loss of attention. And all of those things, as you do it across millions of people, tell you things about the experiences that people are having. If you learn to harness that data, you can give real insight both to the learner and to the teacher about what's may work for whom in what context. So that teachers who today spend all their time searching around on Google to serve an entire class will have resources at their fingertips that might make it much better for them to, I saw the eyes roll, I want to get to your question then. Much better resources at their fingertips to be able to meet the needs of individual students. So there's a lot that technology can bring to bear, especially when mediated through the hands of great teachers, that because of their leaning in and not having either the constraints that we have, some of which are worrisome, but also not having the infrastructure that we have that they need to overcome, they're going to leap forward in large numbers.
A question to you: when I heard you talking about trauma and the ability for in the right setting for us to turn trauma around and utilize that, what does that say to you about a part of the world like Rwanda, where there obviously was a lot of trauma, where, Jim, when I think about, you're talking about places starting over in some ways. Does that offer Rwanda a bigger opportunity to reimagine its education system? And have you seen anything that encourages you there?
This isn't a world that I know about, but in terms of the themes around trauma, when you have countries where the trauma is at the level of the country, you still have to go back to what the basic mechanisms are that cause people to heal. And the things that cause people to heal are the things I was actually talking about. If it's possible to trigger a system that triggers the hormonal chain, the oxytocin hormonal chain, children under unbelievable circumstances can be protected. But the minute you disrupt that, then you have children that are at risk for psychopathy, for horrendous kinds of outcomes. So if a country needed to recover from trauma, my recipe for that country would be how you deepen the relationship net around every child. And children can heal from unbelievable things.
Jim, any thoughts on Rwanda and other countries that have experienced broad trauma?
Everything that Pam said, and then one of the things that I've always been fascinated with is, thinking about Israel in the 70s and 80s when there were bombings going very frequently. The level of stress and trauma across the entire country was at an incredible high, and yet they created the context and culture that things just went on very quickly. That they had students who were performing at very high levels and continued down that path. And the question is, so what are the kinds of things that they did in that context to allow young people to still perform, recognizing that death on the streets was daily? And there was a bunch of things that happened. The tightening of the family and the social and the broader cultural context is something that is already kind of innate in the founding of the country, but they tightened even more. Very specific. A lot of the early advances around the use of learning science and embedding of learning science in instruction, developmental science and relational science, all of that stuff, a lot of it happened, especially in applied through technology, happened in Israel first. And so I think there's some definite lessons to learn there, but I think we've not learned to scale into other environments. So I don't have great answers yet, because usually when you have an environment like Rwanda, you also have a whole lot of other factors that keep you from building a whole stable system. And we've not figured out how to do that yet.
Pam, one more question, then I'm going to go to the audience here. Given all the good work you've done and all the kind of new doors you've opened, where have you gotten it wrong? And what have you learned from getting something meaningfully wrong over the last decade or so?
I mean, the biggest thing that I think we got wrong was actually fairly early. And what I mean by that is that it was very common in the atmosphere of post 9/11 to say that most schools had maybe 15% of kids that needed services because of trauma. So turnaround oriented itself toward, well, let's get services to those kids, seemed logical. But the more we unpacked what was actually really going on in the school, we learned that it was shades of gray, that everybody had been exposed to trauma and adversity to varying degrees, and that putting them with a social worker 2 times a week was not going to address the issues around attention, concentration, focus that was actually interfering with their learning, that we had to become a whole school approach, every adult, hands-on, and that some kids for sure needed services. But I think, and this is going to sound strange coming from me, but when you are a person who's known trauma, you don't like talking about it, and you don't like being identified as somebody who's had a trauma. So children being identified for services is a very difficult subject, and most children who have gone through things even that I went through when I was a kid want to hide. So the idea that services represent a response to trauma, they really don't. That what is a response to trauma are knitting together whole environments where kids have multiple opportunities for connections and where you are not singled out and ashamed.
Questions from the audience? Probably can take 2 or 3.
Hi, my daughter is an elementary school teacher in South Central. My daughter's an elementary school teacher in South Central LA, and Stanford psychology is focused on early childhood development. So I think she'd buy into this. But they had to strike for 7 days to even get a 6% increase in pay and to try to reduce class sizes. I just feel like they are so far away from being able to have enough resources to try to do this model. I'm interested to hear, you're in 20 schools, how are you able to achieve this in terms of just resource level to accomplish it?
We're actually in a lot more than,
sorry.
than 20 schools. But I want to give you a picture of a classroom that has 30 or 35 kids. And picture in that classroom that it would be resourced with some of the kinds of integrated tools that we're talking about. And at a desk, you would have maybe 4 children around the desk. And you would have a teacher that has a tremendous amount of information coming in the form that Jim was talking about each child's learning because of the personalized learning tools that are possible today. But that teacher's walking around the classroom and stopping at a table to talk to a child or to help a table solve a project-based learning project. Okay, these are not giant revolutionary things to do. These are things that are very possible to do today. And everything I just said. But in that classroom, children would feel known. Their learning pathways would be seen by teachers. Their peer relationships would be closer because they would be working on projects together. Okay, in our schools, many of the classrooms look just like that. And there's an openness to doing that. So those are things that are not high-tech, but they are personal, and they do strengthen the connections between teachers and kids and kids and kids.
I just build on that. There are schools that are doing work every day that has them defying the odds. And they're doing it in ways that are simple, like Pam described, and that don't even involve technology. Think about the schools where they actually just lay out every kid and then figure out who actually in the building, what adult in the building actually knows every single child. Like who has a strong relationship and who doesn't have a strong relationship. And then attending to actually ensuring that every child, especially those that you think might be at risk, has a strong relationship with some adult. That takes time, which is a resource, but it doesn't take a lot more money, right? I've seen teachers using walls of their teacher's lounge to be able to have conversations about where each child is developmentally in reading progression, and doing problem solving together around how to meet the specific needs of a child that they all have some experience with. That is a better way to use time that they would be using potentially some other way. So resources are always an issue, but people are finding ways to, this relationship thing, good news is, like, it doesn't have to be bought. You need time for it, but it doesn't have to be bought. And so I think there's a lot of potential. We'll find that we've never costed out what it costs to have a school system where we get it right the first time every time. And right now, we spend about 30+% of our resources on redoing things we didn't done right the first time in most of our high-poverty urban systems. That's a lot of resource. We still need more, but that's a lot.
I just wanted to let folks know about a resource that was something that we recently worked on with our collaborators at Edutopia, and Cindy Johansson is here right now. Edutopia is George Lucas's organization. We did a series of videos where Linda Darling-Hammond spoke to the teacher practice and I spoke to the science. And these are a series of videos in schools across the country today. And you would be amazed at how simple the practices are. You would feel like you could just walk into a classroom and do them, but yet the power that they have developmentally around relationship, but also cognitive development is extraordinary. So I really recommend that you take a look at this series, either on our website or the Edutopia website.
And send them to your daughter.
Yeah, your daughter should definitely see them.
I think I saw a hand over here.
I love the approach, and my question is, you brought up something really interesting, which is trying to think about it from the point of view of also thinking about poverty that the child is in. And I'm just wondering to what extent the child is obviously, say they're in their perfect classroom environment, they're still there 6 hours a day. And I'm just wondering if you have thought about how much of the impact in terms of what's going on for those other hours of the day and how much needs to be addressed there to get these optimal outcomes as well. And I just want to say specifically in this area, I do volunteer in low-income schools here. And so many of them, because of immigration in this area, have had relatives deported. And so I'm just wondering, they're walking into school with that, and if they create the perfect environment in the school, how much are those other factors still need to be addressed for you to break through a lot of that?
Okay. There's one thing that I'd want everybody here to know and to take to heart, and that is that one human connection in your life can change your life. So if you look at an environment called a school, and if that school was committed to that kind of connection with kids, remember the story about oxytocin and resilience to future stress. You can get a biology of a child into a place that is protecting that child from things that are very difficult. So this idea that child goes home to a family situation where those stresses exist, do they go home with resilient capabilities and qualities, with a sense that somebody has faith in them, believes in them, and knows what's possible for them? It's a whole different thing that's possible there. But I'm not going to give you a Pollyanna answer. Reducing the sources of stress in children's lives is something we have to do. We have to do it as a society, and we have to do it as a community. There's no getting around that. But if we look at what biology of children make possible, then we know that resilience is possible, and we know that one human connection can set that process in motion.
I'm going to bounce around and grab a couple of other questions just because
Yeah.
you guys clearly have
Did you want to say
stimulated.
anything to that?
Jim, jump in.
The only thing I was going to say is, imagine if every child living in poverty thought their school was the respite from that condition.
Mm-hmm.
It was the safe place. So.
Yeah, fair.
Pam, you were saying earlier about the principle, how you talk to it in one setting and is like strongly maybe rejecting this approach, and then like in a different setting embraces this type of a trauma-informed, or like a holistic or whole child approach. And earlier you were talking about how the context is so critical in doing this with kids, and so I'm wondering, I think it seems like it's an example of context influencing an adult, and how much of this context and trauma do we have to deal with our leadership and our educators in unison with how we support our kids?
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration, but every professional development experience that Turnaround does, ostensibly on behalf of kids with teachers, results in teachers becoming aware of the traumatic experiences of their own lives, the stress that they have experienced either at home or in the classroom. So one of the other learnings, Carlos has asked, what are some of the things that we got wrong? Underestimating the support that teachers need to be able to do this, and just to be able to listen to the kinds of things that kids are going through is something that where their stress has to be buffered. So it's a really, really important element, certainly of what we do and what needs to be done.
There's a body of work we were able to invest in when I was with CZI that Brooke is leading on teacher well-being, specifically on how they actually support teachers deal with the transfer of stress and trauma that comes from serving kids who have it every day and then what they have in their own lives. I want to tease out, though, a separate issue, which is there is this, because of what we believe and because of the systems we created, there's this tension that many leaders feel that if they acknowledge these other factors, they're somehow letting you off the hook on the academic outcomes. And so they avoid having the conversation that, yeah, these things matter, just like this academic outcome matters. I'm not saying that they don't matter. They don't want to say that they don't matter, but they have to keep their eye on, as Pam pointed out at the beginning, the outcome they're responsible for producing. And so we have to make it okay to say, actually, it all matters. And actually, if we attend to them all, it's going to get better. This notion that you start with what do you believe, and then are we willing to do the things that actually address these other things, and then fill it in with what we now know how to do, like then we can actually execute on something that's going to deliver for our children. But it does start with this belief system thing and confronting the fact that we're scared to say, yeah, it's both.
I see lots of good hands. I'm going to come here, then I'm going to come here, and then did I see some hands over here? So I'm